Well, another country that may soon have to confront weeks of coalition talks is Italy. The polls open there in just a few hours' time as people vote for a new government. Immigration and high youth unemployment have been the dominant issues of the campaign. Polls suggest that the former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's centre-right alliance could emerge as the largest bloc in a hung parliament. Well, joining us live from Boston, Massachusetts is Julia Ebner, who's a research fellow at the London-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who's been monitoring far-right activity in the run-up to the election. Thanks a lot for joining us, Julia. Just explain to us what form this far-right activity is taking.
Yes, well, so we've seen Italian extreme right groups mobilize across the country, but also joining up and collaborating with international far-right groups to influence the election outcome in favor of the far-right parties, and in particular of Lega Nord, but also Brothers of Italy and the other far-right parties like Casa Pound. So they have especially mobilized in the online space to influence the online discourse and, for example, coordinate their activities in private messaging groups to then push it out into the mainstream.
Is this people on, say, their Facebook accounts or their Twitter feeds seeing content from this group, from these groups? Is that how it works?
Well, yes, so exactly. So they would start by, for example, recruiting more people into their private messaging groups on some of the messaging boards, and then they would coordinate and share, for example, resources to carry out what we call influencer operations or information operations on mainstream social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, but also Instagram.
Some of these groups are fairly fringe groups. They're not particularly influential in the grand scheme of things. But what effect do they have on the overall discourse of the politics?
So that is something we've seen in previous elections. We've especially closely followed the German election campaigns that were led by far-right extremists in Germany, and they've had a tremendous impact on setting the agenda for the online discourse, but then also influencing some of the political topics that were actually picked up both by the media, but also then in the debates between politicians. So that is something where we see them increasingly being able to shape the discourse in the run-up to elections and to actually start getting into the top trends on social media by tricking, for example, also the algorithms.
I'm interested in where these groups come from, because you talk about like a kind of international coalition of far-right groups. I mean, where are they from? I mean, we're talking about the Italian elections at the moment, but what other countries get involved?
Yes, well, so in this case, it's interesting because the conversation started and the recruitment conversation started in English, but then as soon as they were taken to the encrypted messaging chats, they were in Italian. So most of the groups are Italian, but they have links, and they, for example, would also share materials and copy the tactics that we've seen from the alt-right. So this suggests that there are some direct links also to the American alt-right. They also use the same vocabulary and call themselves the Italian alt-right.
Is this the kind of thing which we should just expect will happen from now on in elections across Europe?
Yeah, I think this is something we're starting to see a pattern here. We've also monitored the French, the Dutch, the German and Austrian elections, and they seem to get better and more sophisticated with every election, and especially the outcome of the US election and Trump's victory has really emboldened some of these groups and taught them in a way that knowledge sharing on a global level can have a big impact.
Do mainstream politicians know what is happening? I mean, I'm not saying that they're being hijacked, but do they know that they're sort of being nudged or influenced to a certain extent? Do they even care?
Well, so I mean, for the far-right politicians, there are clearly converging interests. So in many of the cases, there would be there would be at least an awareness, a level of awareness that we assume among these politicians, because their campaigns and their propaganda is being shared on a massive level by extreme right-wing activists. And that is something where, well, also, for example, in the German election, we even saw that some of the German members of the Alternative for Germany were involved in some of these campaigns and were actually collaborating with the extreme right activists. So this is still something we're trying to find out more about for the Italian case.
Okay, thank you very much. That's Julia Ebner, Research Fellow at the London-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue.